studying your last two. I swim med when they turned in. The styren down to mute. And can learn the pole that sunk he died.
At this stage, it is helpful to step back and look at the major TOSI exceptions as a complete system, rather than viewing them as isolated rules. Think of them as a collection of pathways that can potentially remove a dividend from the TOSI regime. One of the most important exceptions is the excluded business exception. This exception generally focuses on active involvement in the business. If an individual has been regularly, continuously, and meaningfully engaged in the operations of the business, dividends received by that person may qualify for relief from TOSI. Another key exception is the excluded shares exception. This exception focuses on the ownership structure of the corporation and the nature of the shares owned by the shareholder. When certain legislative requirements are satisfied, dividends on those shares may avoid TOSI. The reasonable return exception takes a different approach. Instead of focusing primarily on ownership or participation, it examines whether the return being received is reasonable when compared to the individual's contribution of labor, capital, financial risk, or other relevant factors. There is also a special rule that may provide relief in certain situations involving individuals who are 65 years of age or older and their spouses. This rule recognizes that family business structures often change as owners approach retirement. In addition to these exceptions, the legislation also identifies certain excluded amounts. These are amounts that may already fall outside the TOSI regime because they meet specific legislative criteria. Finally, there are several other specialized exceptions that apply in particular circumstances. Although these rules are less commonly encountered, they can be important in the right fact pattern. When a practitioner reviews a dividend payment, the analysis often centers on determining whether one of these exceptions or excluded amounts applies. If an applicable exception can be established and properly supported, the dividend may receive normal dividend tax treatment, rather than being taxed under the TOSI rules. The key takeaway from this slide is that TOSI is not simply a collection of restrictions. It also contains several relief provisions. Understanding these major exceptions is the foundation for determining whether a dividend can successfully avoid the TOSI regime. One of the most common sources of confusion in the TOSI rules is the distinction between an exception and an excluded amount. Although both can prevent TOSI from applying, they do not operate in exactly the same way. A TOSI exception is something that must be earned by meeting specific legislative requirements. Think of it as a locked gate. Before the dividend can pass through, the taxpayer must demonstrate that the conditions of the exception have been satisfied. For example, the excluded business exception requires evidence of regular and meaningful involvement in the business. The excluded shares exception requires specific ownership conditions to be met. The reasonable return exception requires an analysis of whether the return is appropriate based on the individual's contribution. In each case, a test must be performed before the exception is granted. An excluded amount works differently. Instead of requiring the taxpayer to pass a particular test, the legislation already treats certain amounts as being outside the TOSI regime. In these situations, the income may bypass TOSI without needing to satisfy one of the major exception tests. You can think of excluded amounts as a special category of income that the legislation has chosen not to subject to TOSI, provided the applicable conditions are met. Certain age-based relief provisions and other legislative exclusions can fall into this category. From a practical perspective, both paths can lead to the same result. The dividend avoids TOSI and receives normal tax treatment. However, the route taken is different. With an exception, the practitioner must usually analyze the facts, perform a test, and demonstrate that the requirements have been satisfied. With an excluded amount, The focus is often on determining whether the income falls within a category that the legislation has already removed from TOSI. Understanding this distinction helps practitioners navigate the rules more efficiently. It also prevents the common mistake of treating every TOSI relief provision as though it operates in the same way. The key takeaway from this slide is simple. Exceptions generally require testing and proof. Excluded amounts are already outside the TOSI regime because the legislation specifically excludes them. Both can lead to a favorable result, but they arrive there through different mechanisms. When reviewing a dividend under the TOSI rules, experienced practitioners rarely analyze the exceptions in a random order. Instead, they typically follow a logical sequence, starting with the strongest and most straightforward exceptions before moving to more complex alternatives. Think of this process as climbing a staircase. At the bottom, we have a dividend that is subject to TOSI review. The objective is to move upward until we reach the top, where the dividend qualifies for normal dividend tax treatment and TOSI no longer applies. One of the first exceptions practitioners often consider is the excluded business exception. This is frequently the strongest and most commonly used exception because it focuses on active involvement in the business. If the shareholder has been regularly and meaningfully engaged in the operations of the company, this exception may provide a clear path out of TOSI. If the excluded business exception is not available, attention may shift to the excluded shares exception. This involves examining the ownership structure of the corporation and determining whether the legislative requirements for qualifying shares have been satisfied. The next level often involves the reasonable return exception. Here, the analysis focuses on whether the amount received is reasonable when compared to the shareholders' contributions of labor, capital, risk, or other relevant factors. Additional relief may also be available under the age 65 rule, which can provide special treatment in certain situations involving older business owners and their spouses. Finally, practitioners may review other specialized exceptions that apply to particular circumstances and fact patterns. The important point is not the exact order itself. The important point is having a systematic process. By moving through the available exceptions in a logical manner, practitioners can focus their efforts on the most promising opportunities first and avoid overlooking important relief provisions. Notice the professional tip highlighted on the slide. Start with the strongest exception first. If a clear exception applies early in the analysis, there may be no need to spend time evaluating every other possible rule. The key takeaway from this slide is that successful TOSI analysis is organized and methodical, rather than randomly searching through legislation. Practitioners follow a structured hierarchy of exceptions, evaluate the strongest candidates first, and document their conclusions based on the facts and evidence available.